Okay, so let me welcome everybody who has already come online, but others will naturally hear this or see this later. To continue from the last time, as I had mentioned with a quotation from Michelangelo, that he saw an angel in the stone and chiseled until he released the angel. This is really the chiseling we need to do about the kleshas. Kleshas are, let me simply remind you again, these are the impediments that stand in our way. And what is the aim? As Patanjali's Yoga Sutra mentioned, this is the second sutra in the second chapter. Let me quickly remind you. The aim of yoga or practice of yoga, he says, is to cultivate Samadhi and to work towards diminishing the kleshas, meaning diminishing what stands in the way. So then we now look at the screen where I have continued with the second chapter. I'll largely stay with the second chapter, and it's the 10th sutra in the second chapter. These subtle kleshas can be overcome by reversing the natural flow and returning to the source. It is very important for us to understand that all spiritual practice is in a direction contrary to our usual tendencies, and which is also what this sutra is saying. The reason for that is very simple, or if you like, metaphysically fairly straightforward, that the whole manifested universe requires that the forces of nature work towards more and more manifestation. If one uses more or less the Indian way of looking at it, where we speak not in terms of higher and higher levels, but we tend to speak in terms of deeper and deeper levels, because of the fundamental assumption that the very highest energy or highest being, God, resides in our deepest. So it's very strong attitude in India. This is why you would see practically all spiritually oriented diagrams from India, thankas in Buddhism or Hinduism or anywhere. They would be concentric circles or concentric triangles or right angles. So, using that metaphor, the way one would say is that the general forces of nature are centrifugal. They are moving away from the center, outward. Whereas spiritual practice makes us to connect with those forces which are centripetal, meaning moving towards the center. So in that sense, it is exactly the reversal of that direction. Let me, while I'm continuing with this, actually move to the very next slide as well, where I use these two words. Pratiprasava is the word that Patanjali actually uses in this sutra that I just quoted, and literally it means counter flow. That our mind has a natural tendency to be oriented outward. There is nothing wrong about this. One needs to understand that that is the way the manifested universe actually works. There is another way of looking at it, or this is a very classical way of putting it, that we have two natures. Sometimes they're simply called higher nature and lower nature. St. Paul, for example, refers to them as spiritual nature and carnal nature. Often other images get used, such as angelic nature and demonic nature. This is an expression in the Bhagavad Gita. Or other expressions such as angelic nature and animal nature. What is being suggested simply that we have both of these natures. Another way of saying that we are children of both heaven and earth. And the important thing is to actually honor both of these parents, but in the right order, so that we take care of the earth, care of things in time, with the consideration of eternity, in the light of heaven, if you like. So the whole practice of yoga is not meant to forget about our concern for the earth. Although I should keep reminding you that in India, as in many other traditions, there is a very ascetic streak which basically moves away from any concern for the earth, that this is all Maya or illusion. This is not really to be taken seriously. We should all move towards the spirit. And really every religion is always very eager to somehow get to heaven, forgetting that we are in this body, in this incarnation, for some purpose. It is not pointless to be in the body. I will return to this point again. Body is absolutely necessary, even though the suggestion is again and again that this body needs to serve something else, to serve the spirit. So, coming back to the sutra here, Pratiprasav is the Sanskrit way of saying counterflow. I occasionally end up giving these Sanskrit words because every translation is a sort of a transcreation. And depending very much on the general philosophical attitude of the person who is translating, for example, I earlier gave this example of Abhinivesh. Some people who seem somehow finding their life so miserable would end up translating this, which is a very common translation. You can look up in many Yoga Sutra books, as if this means wish to continue living, as if there is something wrong with this. Literally, it simply means wish for continuation of whatever the state is. Similarly, other words. So I end up using a few of these Sanskrit words to draw your attention. Actually, anybody can learn. Maximum you need to learn about 20 words, probably no more than that. And my partner occasionally reminds me that even a chimpanzee apparently can learn 40 words, so it's not so difficult for us. So, coming back to this word, Pratiprasav literally means the counterflow. And the suggestion there is very much that there are naturally outward tendencies or centrifugal tendencies which need to be overcome. That does not mean that we need to withdraw from the world or to forget about the planet or forget about our body. None of this is suggested, although that streak exists. Continuing with the next sutra here. This is again very interesting. What is the cause of suffering? That suffering exists can hardly be denied. In fact, this is the very first noble truth of the Buddha, that there is suffering. Then there are different people put what is the cause of that suffering in a slightly different way. For example, for the Buddha, this is another of the noble truths of the Buddha, that the cause of suffering is really selfishness or selfish craving, sometimes translated as desire. For Krishnamurti, the cause of suffering seems to be thought, that is what leads to suffering. But for Patanjali, it's rather interesting to look at this sutra. The cause of suffering is the misidentification of the seer with the seen. What is easily seen, if we look at ourselves, is our own body. And to imagine that that's what I am, that is a misidentification of the seer with the seen. And this again, if you recall, previous occasion I had shown some of these slides, that what is avidya, what is ignorance, to take the transient for the eternal was one of the ways. So if we misidentify what the seer is, and that is basically the seen, then that is the cause of suffering, according to Patanjali, which is a little different way of saying from other people. And if you now recall, I'm slightly stepping back. We showed this slide last time. What is Asmita? That is exactly the misidentification of the power of seeing with what is seen. Here he speaks about the power of seeing. In the earlier slide that I just showed, it was the seer. But recall again, the chief characteristic of the seer is the power of seeing. In fact, here is the other sutra which says exactly what I just finished saying. Namely, the seer is only the power of pure seeing. We have a tendency just to speak about seeing without the seer. Somehow grammatically doesn't make sense, because we are accustomed in English and in most languages, subject, object, predicate. So we end up creating a subject. But really what is being suggested, that actual real seeing is in which seer, seeing, and the seen all come together. I had mentioned this last time as well. That is called samapatti, a fusion, coming together of all of these characteristics. So we continue with this here, that asmita is really essentially, as I mentioned last time as well, literally it means I am this. That means I remove myself from the whole ocean or the whole reservoir of being and identify myself with one particular aspect that then separates me from the whole. And the separate self would be another way of translating asmita. And the separate self is by nature also a separating self. It separates me from the others because I'm different from the others. I'm not related with the others. And all relationship, whatever kind it is, requires some element of love. On the other hand, no love can actually exist if I'm wholly occupied with me, me, me. So that is another way of understanding asmita. That the very nature of asmita as a separating self interferes with my relationship with anything else. Not only other persons, but with nature generally, looking at a tree or a puppy dog. All relationships require a certain kind of affection, certain kind of love, and that is interfered with by much more occupation with me, me, me. So, asmita is something that we really need to understand. We are separating ourselves from the whole ocean of being by identifying myself with one drop of it. So, here then we see that the connection between the seer and the seen causes a mistaken perception of identity. Now, again, I know this is a very strong streak in India, and I keep alerting you. If you take something seriously, you need to really question it. Precisely because I take the Indian tradition very seriously, I question it so that I can assist its purification, its cleansing, because it's absolutely inevitable everywhere. This is actually almost the law of time. Krishna even speaks about it in the Bhagavad Gita, that I taught this very yoga in the beginning, but because of the ravages of time, it has been lost. It is inevitable. And so, therefore one needs to question the tradition, but it's a very strong streak in the Indian tradition, also ends up entering into the Theosophical Society, sadly, from my point of view, that as if what we need to do is to separate the seer from the seen, which literally in this context will mean to separate Purusha from Prakriti, so that the spirit is completely separated from the body. This is not at all the intention of Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra, as I will just show you specific sutras. Well, first of all, before I go there, again Patanjali identifies avidya, ignorance, as the main source of all these problems. This is throughout the Indian tradition. I personally don't know any sage in India or any text in India which says otherwise, namely that ignorance is the source of all our difficulties and problems and predicaments. And so Patanjali is basically following the same tradition here. And then he says, with the disappearance of ignorance, this misidentification no longer exists. The pure seeing alone remains, not the seer separated from the seen, which is a very strong tendency, as if I need to get rid of the body and become pure spirit. There is no such suggestion in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And again, very strong idea that what is required is discernment. The Sanskrit word is viveka. Sometimes it is translated as discrimination, to be able to discriminate between one thing or another, between truth and falsity, for example. But the word discrimination in contemporary English has acquired slightly other meanings also. So I advise you to come to the word discernment as maybe a more proper, at least in contemporary usage, a more proper translation of this. So viveka is the way to overcome ignorance. Now, this is extremely important for me to keep emphasizing. Religions everywhere, more organized they become, more they get to this tendency, keep emphasizing faith. There is no such emphasis in the classical texts of yoga, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras or the Bhagavad Gita. These are the two texts that I would more, because I have wrestled with them for many years, I can keep speaking about them more and more. These are classical texts of yoga. To be sure, there is a Sanskrit word called Shraddha, which can be translated as faith, but it means many other things. It means respect, confidence, trust. And Patanjali does in passing, for example, in the 30th sutra, in the first chapter, does mention Shraddha. But there is no yoga of faith. There is yoga of action, yoga of knowledge, yoga of love, yoga of meditation. Nobody mentioned any yoga of faith. Faith is generally something that interferes with search. Now, we don't need to be against faith. As I even said last time as well, we don't need to be against anything. There is a kind of faith which can actually help search or research. As an example, all the great scientists, or even minor ones, have a faith that there is order in the universe. Now, this can't be proved, but it assists them. Furthermore, the additional faith is that their research will help reveal that order. So that faith is very helpful in assisting research. But most religions talk about faith that does not assist spiritual search. So we need to be very careful about this. Yoga is not a religion. It is a discipline, a practice for transformation. It's the science par excellence of transformation. And there, viveka or discernment or knowledge, jnana, we'll come back to that later on also, are the important features. But don't need to be against faith if it assists search. For example, I have a faith that what the Buddha said or Christ said actually has profound meaning, even though I don't understand what they are really saying. Maybe when I grow up or when I mature, I will be able to understand something. So that is a matter of faith. But it assists my search. So don't be against faith, but don't easily buy it. Don't easily buy anything that anybody says, including me. Here we are. Any notion that we need to separate the seer and the seen would be very surprising to Patanjali, because as he explicitly says, and here is the sutra, the seen is for the sake of the seer. Perhaps just to put other words here would be helpful. The body is for the sake of the spirit. Prakriti is for the sake of Purusha. That does not mean they need to be separated. In India, it is said that even the devas or the gods or the angels will have to be born in a human body to make further spiritual progress. So why do we have a body? Just purely accidentally? Any serious teaching, including the Yoga Sutras, will tell you that the body is necessary. In fact, I quoted this last time from Ishwar Krishna, who is the author of Sankhya Karika, which is more or less the sort of sisterly discipline of yoga. Sankhya and yoga are commonly coupled together in the Bhagavad Gita also very much. And there he explicitly says that Purusha without Prakriti is lame, and Prakriti without Purusha is blind. They need to come together. Why should I be born in this body if it is completely pointless? The whole spiritual domain everywhere would say that the spirit for its own purposes needs a body. That's why it comes into my body. So if the body does not serve the spirit, then it's not doing anything useful from the spirit point of view. So it's not that the body is unnecessary or the seen in this particular expression of Patanjali. No, both the seen and the seer are required. The body is necessary, but not the most important thing. It needs to be finding its proper place with respect to the spirit. I should also here, perhaps a little bit going back here, the suggestion about the power of seeing, this can hardly be overemphasized. The whole project of a spiritual discipline is to be able to assist us to see more and more subtly. Just to remind you, this is a remark of St. Paul. Eyes of the flesh see the things of the flesh. Eyes of the spirit, the things of the spirit. So we need to develop slightly different eyes. Eyes of the flesh can be extended enormously with all kinds of fancy telescopes and microscopes, but they still remain eyes of the flesh. You cannot see an angel with those instruments. Do we dismiss Christ or Moses or the Buddha who could see angels? They have different eyes. There is only one of the very few remarks of Christ which you can find in all the canonical Gospels and also in Prophet Isaiah, also in one letter of St. Paul. And that remark is, you have eyes but you do not see. You have ears but you do not hear. The whole program of any spiritual discipline, including yoga, is to be able to assist us to open our subtler or spiritual eyes so we can see what we do not ordinarily see. And we have a classical example of this in the Bhagavad Gita, when after much transformation of Arjuna already having taken place, Krishna shows his great form to him. Arjuna is unable to see. So Krishna actually says to him, you cannot see me with your ordinary eyes. Therefore I will give you divine eyes. The Sanskrit expression is divya chakshu. Devic eyes or divine eyes. So it's very important to understand this, that what is at issue here is cleansing of perceptions. And we have a lovely remark of William Blake. When the doors of perception are cleansed, everything is seen as it is, infinite. This is very important. Cleansing of the perception actually enhances the mystery. One realizes that everything is wonderful and cannot be captured. We have an ancient Upanishad says, unless it is wonderful, 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 it cannot be holy. It is actually the mark of any serious spiritual experience that it surprises the experiencer. Otherwise, the mind is always projecting something or the other. Sooner or later, it manages to see it in its own way. So, this remark of William Blake is useful to think about, that when the eyes are cleansed or the perception is cleansed, one sees everything as it is, infinite. More and more a state of unknowing, not of ignorance. But one is open to whatever may come, and it becomes grander and grander, more and more mysterious. So, the scene, which is, we could say, Prakriti or the body, is for the sake of the seer, Purusha or the spirit. And here we have another emphasis on jnana and viveka. Jnana, just to translate this, would be knowledge. Gnosis is the Greek cognate of the word jnana. And here we can see, again, very much emphasis on serious, subtle knowing and discernment. That is the emphasis of any serious spiritual teaching. Then one can think of love. Otherwise, unless there is some appropriate action and knowledge, to think of love simply becomes sentimental. Which is why, just to quickly to remind you, for the first 6 chapters in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna does not even once mention the yoga of love or bhakti yoga. He simply speaks about karma yoga and jnana yoga. Yoga of action and yoga of knowledge. Not ordinary knowledge, sacred knowledge or subtle knowledge, as in the word gnosis. So, avidya, as we earlier said here, is just the contrary of vidya or of jnana or viveka. And that is, of course, really the, if you like, outcome of the power of apasmara, the demon of forgetfulness. The very fact that I forget what I am in fact is the source of avidya. Then Patanjali very much speaks about other limbs of yoga, which is another reason, by the way, why yoga is sometimes called, or Patanjali's yoga is called Ashtanga yoga. Ashtanga literally means 8 limbs. So these are the 8 limbs of yoga that he mentions, which is another good reason to remember that yoga is not simply standing on one leg or in a Nataraj position or in a lotus position or some other position. That is very preliminary, elementary yoga. One doesn't need to be against it. The body is necessary and it needs to be in good shape. I will come back to this in a moment here, but let me first of all remind you here, there are 8 limbs. And I have them here both in Sanskrit words and more or less English translation. Yam, niyam. These are two ways of saying something that one should not do, sort of do and not do. So yam and niyam. Yam is something that one should restrain from. Niyam is something that one should try to practice. Then asana, alignment is the translation that I have given here, sometimes translated as posture. I'll come back to this in a moment. Pranayama, regulation of breath. Pratyahára, which is withdrawal of the senses. Dharana, which will be more or less concentration. Dhyana is generally translated as meditation. And Samadhi, which is really free attention, free of me, me, me. This is what I earlier had quoted. Again, I will come back to this. This is the third sutra in the third chapter. Patanjali describes Samadhi as Swarupa Shunya, free of the self. Very interesting remark of Krishnamurti. As long as I am, love is not. Not an easy thing to realize. I am, of course, there. One needs to exist. But am I the center? As long as it is occupied with me, 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 there can be no love. And it is the freedom from the self. That is what Samadhi is. And that is the aim of yoga, as I have said several times already. Let's quickly look at the yamas and the niyamas. The first yama, the Sanskrit word may be useful here. Most people know this. You can even find this in standard English dictionaries these days, is the word ahimsa, which is almost always translated as non-violence. And here I am giving this translation as non-violation. Now, obviously, given our limited time, I cannot really speak about all of these things in any detail, but I might choose one or two things here. Otherwise, I'll have to refer you to my book on the Yoga Sutras. But ahimsa, especially with the influence of Mahatma Gandhi, somehow got very much associated with physical non-harming, which is very strange. The Supreme Court of Canada, unfortunately, has many, many cases in which usually it's women who feel sexually harassed, but there is no physical harming. There is no sign of a torn skirt, there is no bruises, nothing. But they're still harassed. Gandhi made it all really very cheap. He himself was actually not at all non-violent. Because if one understands, supposing I say to somebody, unless you marry me, I'm going to commit suicide. What am I doing? I'm blackmailing a person. I'm violating a person. So in many of these cases in our courts, the women feel violated even though there is no sign of physical harming. So ahimsa is a much stronger practice. It is against any kind of manipulation, blackmailing, violating a person, not only just physically harming somebody. So it's hard to find an appropriate English word for this, so I use the word non-violation here. So similarly, each of these things need to be understood with much more subtlety than, unfortunately, the ordinary language allows you to do this. But I quickly want to move on with the niyamas. My time is going to be very limited here. And here, I especially want to draw your attention to two things. First of all, the last three niyamas which are mentioned here, you can see quickly: tapas, swadhyaya, and Ishwar pranidhan. These were also mentioned as the activities of yoga by Patanjali in the first sutra of the second chapter. So very much emphasis on these three. And I now won't say very much more about it. You can go back to if you wish, this was the second webinar I essentially devoted to these three things. But the other thing I want to also draw your attention to is this expression contentment. The Sanskrit word is santosh. I say that here because if you look at the periodically great philosophers or theologians even would have a list of virtues. It's interesting to me that in the Western tradition generally, you can even look at Plato, for example, great philosophers, contentment is not considered a particularly high virtue. In India, it is regarded very highly, and here is an example of this. There is a shadow side of contentment. It can interfere with the spirit of exploration. You see, everything has its shadow. One has to realize very great enunciations of the very great teachers and sages can have their shadow side. And so you can be just easily contented with something. So you don't need to explore for something. You don't need to question. So that is the dangerous side of it. On the other hand, it's useful to remember that in Indian tradition, it's very strongly recommended contentment, or santosh is the Sanskrit word for it. Now, asana is often translated as posture, and most of the people practicing yoga, as far as I can see, even in India, and not only in North America, they are just doing asanas. This might surprise people. I don't want to name names here. Some of you are very highly regarded asana or yoga teachers who have set many thousands of organizations around the world. They had very little interest in any meditation, which is what Patanjali is mainly interested in. But asana, first of all, to again remind you, these two classical texts of yoga, namely the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras, don't mention any asana by name. That's not their interest. And you can see here, asana is accompanied by steadiness and ease, and this is attained when there is complete relaxation and union with the infinite. Then one is no longer assailed by opposing dualities. So, strictly speaking, except at the very highest level of God Himself, or the Absolute, if you use another language, or Brahma, we cannot really have the right asana, simply because the complete relaxation is not possible except at the highest level, simply because there are varieties of different laws operating. But in any case, that's the direction. So an asana, a posture, or personally I actually recommend the translation as alignment, because we also have intellectual postures. If I can remind myself that even if I had a combined intelligence of Einstein, Newton, Shankara, Aristotle, and Nagarjuna, even then, I cannot know all there is to know. That is a mental attitude. That is a posture that would then allow me not to be capturing everything with my rational mind. It would allow me to realize that there are great mysteries, how to celebrate the mysteries, which is the reason for reminding again and again that asana is not only a physical posture, it is also a mental and an emotional posture. In fact, it might interest some of you who know French. The French word for posture is attitude. That already conveys partly what I'm trying to convey. What is my attitude to anything? That is part of my alignment to the whole vastness of reality. How am I aligned towards it? Am I trying to capture it in my little mind? Or am I open to the great mystery and celebrating it? So, asana has many of these other meanings connected with it. But it is important, on the other hand, to realize, as Patanjali obviously realizes, that awakening of the body is as necessary as the compassionate heart and insightful mind. And here is a remark of the Buddha that I very much recommend to you to read carefully. There is one thing that when cultivated and regularly practiced leads to deep spiritual intention, to peace, to mindfulness and clear comprehension, to vision and knowledge, to a happy life here and now, and to the culmination of wisdom and awakening. And what is that one thing? It is mindfulness centered in the body. It is extremely important for us to realize that any notion that the body is unnecessary, that we can get rid of it, we don't need to take care of it, is completely silly. Body is the instrument of the spirit, or to use St. Paul's lovely expression, it's the temple of the spirit. So, to take care of the body and to actually recognize the importance of it, it can be the right instrument. Also, it can be the wrong instrument, or one can wholly get occupied with shining the instrument and not doing anything with it, and just making sure that the instrument is sharp, but that's it. But otherwise, there is a great emphasis on finding the right attitude, right posture, right alignment. In fact, in some Zen practice, particularly the very famous Zen teacher Dogen, he's often called, rather than Dogen Roshi, Dogen Zenzi, which is meaning a great Roshi, he used to actually say that posture is all. that all Zen is about posture, having the right posture. So, there is no need to be, in any sense, to be against the body, but to actually recognize that the body is meant to serve something. It's not because it's obvious it's going to die. And if it is serving only itself, only its own needs, then it is not really the reason for which the spirit has taken on this body. Time is limited, so I'm going to continue with this. So then pranayama. Now, pranayama is not so much a control of breath as it is occasionally translated. It is really more to do with the regulation of breath. And really, the greatest pranayama is simply to watch the breathing taking place. And as I have already said earlier, whatever I pay attention to, inevitably changes in its quality and in its relationship with me. I am breathing just like you all the time. In general, I am not aware of my breathing. If and when I become aware of it, the quality of my breathing will change, and it will have a different effect on my body. That is absolutely the most significant pranayama. But then, of course, one can also watch when one stops breathing or how long one holds this and that. All kinds of variations can be made on it. But also, the word breath in contemporary English does not quite convey the kind of depth that the Chinese word chi or the Sanskrit word prana still more or less manages to convey. Which is to say that it is actually the connecting link between all levels of reality. It is not just ordinary air that we are talking about. It is actually a whole spectrum of energy, prana, just as chi. In fact, just to remind you, this is from the book of Genesis, 6th chapter. God created human beings from the earth. Sometimes it is said from the dust, different translation. Created them from the earth, and then he breathed his own breath into them to make them alive. The very fact that we are alive means we have a breath of God into us. And this is how we recognize when a baby is born that the baby is going to live, when he or she begins to breathe. And when a person stops breathing, that's the end. This may not be the technical definition of death, but for any other purposes, this is the fundamental reality. The fact that breathing is taking place means that one is alive. And as I just quoted from the Bible, book of Genesis, it is an indication that one is alive because there is a connecting link between right from God to the earth, to the matter, to the body. And therefore the whole question of pranayama needs to be taken much more seriously, and we need to understand, and it's essentially regulation of breathing. Actually, the oldest Upanishad, Pratyahára Upanishad, actually says prana vai Brahma. Prana is Brahma, which is the highest reality. It's the label for the very highest reality. There is also a little story in Chandogya Upanishad which might amuse you. You know, the various organs in the body are beginning to argue with each other who is more important. So the eyes say, oh, well, if I go away, then you won't be able to see anything. So the ears say, oh, you can't really hear anything, etc., etc. So the prana says to them, okay, you decide, I'm going away. Then they all say to him, please don't go. For the obvious reason that prana is, without prana, neither the eye nor the ear or anything else will work. So, prana vai Brahma is the expression in Sanskrit from one of the Upanishads, which means prana is Brahma. Okay, the next limb of yoga is Pratyahára, which is the withdrawal of the senses. This is actually a very important aspect to understand, and the classical analogy that is given in India generally about this is like the tortoise withdraws all its senses. Bhagavad Gita also uses this analogy. The important thing here to see is this. Let me make this as may seem like a dogmatic statement, so don't buy it easily, but think about it. The mind does not experience anything. All experience is by the senses. Spiritual experience by internalized senses. You can close your eyes even, and you can look within, and you can say, I see what is happening. I see that my mind is wandering off, or that my mind is steady, or that I have some feeling of resentment or anxiety or of compassion, whatever. I can close my eyes. It is to say, it's the internalized sensation, internalized senses. In fact, a very great sage in India, Sri Anirvan, died only in 1978. I had a great fortune to spend about half an hour with him, and he made this remark that even the subtlest spiritual experiences are experienced as a sensation in the body. And I am now repeating this remark, the mind does not experience. Then it can see that I have experienced something internally, then it can suggest some other experience. It's exactly the same in the sciences. There the senses are externalized. We don't accept anything as a measurement in science unless some external sense has actually noticed it. Let me make this remark again, and you need to think about it. This is really the whole emphasis of Pratyahára, why I need to withdraw my senses so that my internalized senses can become sharper and sharper, that I become not only more and more sensitive to what is going on in my body, but that I can experience subtler and subtler experiences, that the mind is not the experiencer, which is also the reason why there is so much emphasis. Patanjali, the very second sutra in the first chapter, that the mind needs to be quiet. The yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is stopping all the movements of the mind. Why? So that the mind is not interfering with the experiencing by the internalized senses. This is actually, I know, I'm of course speaking about the Yoga Sutras, and which is a great emphasis there. All the great mystics in the world would emphasize this, but it might also interest you to know. Here I'm going to quote to you, this is Psalm 46. Be still and know that I am. Sometimes they add, I am God. That is just added just to make it a sentence. But simply, that's all it says. And then Exodus, this is chapter 14, the Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. We don't actually realize the importance and the significance of the still mind. Perception of a still mind, according to all the great spiritual teachers, is the only perception worth bothering about. Otherwise, the mind has this knowledge, that knowledge. We don't need to be against any of that. But as I have earlier quoted from Patanjali himself, that the kind of knowledge, we may still use the word knowledge because we don't have other words in English, that the kind of knowledge which is obtained in the still mind is of a very different quality. It is not what we ordinarily would regard scientific or philosophical or scriptural knowledge. Okay, let me continue. Then we have, by the way, Patanjali says that these previous 5 limbs of yoga that he has described so far are relative to the remaining 3 external limbs. Now we are speaking slightly more internally. Dharana is holding the mind in one place. I am still there, but I focus my mind. It's like bringing a flashlight into a dark room. It doesn't show me the connection between various things, but I can look at one thing sharply. Dhyana, on the other hand, earlier Patanjali had also described this, that there is, I am still there, but the object is there more and more. And it is, he says, the uninterrupted flow of awareness towards the object of attention. Often this word gets translated as meditation. I should quickly mention here as a historical remark, when Buddhism went to China, Dhyan was not translated, but was just pronounced in a Chinese way as Chan. And then when from China Buddhism went to Korea, it was pronounced as Son. And when it went to Japan, from Korea, it was pronounced as Zen. Zen is the Japanese pronunciation of the Korean pronunciation of the Chinese pronunciation of Dhyana. Might interest you to know this as a historical remark. So, Dharana and Dhyana are 2 different kinds of attention, if you like, in which it's a question of how much is being contributed by the observer and how much is being contributed by what is being observed, or the seer and the seen. And then Samadhi is, if you like, another form of attention. This we already had spoken about last time. Samadhi is the state when the self is not, when there is awareness only of the object of meditation, as if I am completely out of the way. This is why it is said to be the most objective knowledge, that the subject is completely out of the way. Not so easy, but it is good to keep this in mind. What is the direction or what is the aim of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras? And then, maybe I have to rush a little bit here. Let me draw your attention to that the combination of these 3 things is what is called sanyam. I am translating this as total attention. It also literally means discipline. So the real discipline, sanyam, is a combination of dharana, dhyana and samadhi. Then Patanjali says that the illumination of insight results from the mastery of this. In fact, if we are having a whole project these days about how science needs to be extended, we need extended scientists or more transformed scientists to do real science. But part of that is, my project there is to indicate that why is yoga not a science? It requires precisely the kind of scientific research, but it has a different direction. Patanjali, for example, takes the very universal idea that the small microcosmos that I am, every human being is, can in principle mirror the whole large cosmos. The two Sanskrit words are, the whole cosmos is called Brahmand, or the egg of Brahma, and a human being is called a Kshudra Brahmand, a small Brahman, a small egg of Brahma. So that they can mirror each other. Therefore, Patanjali's way of doing natural science is to see what inside me can actually mirror what I need to study outside. And by bringing total attention to that, by bringing sanyam to that part within me, I can study what is taking place outside. Now, this may surprise people, but this is why one is always amazed why some of these ancients could produce amazing results that completely wow us even now. How could they know this? Even a tribe in Mali, which people regard as savages, were speaking about one of the stars which were not even discovered by the scientists until hardly about 25 years ago in the Andromeda galaxy. So there we are. How do they know all this? We could dismiss all this, but to me, this will be really shortchanging ourselves. So my time is getting ahead, so let me proceed here. Again, very strong emphasis that jnana born of viveka is liberating, comprehensive, eternal, and freed of time sequence. The knowledge which is created by viveka, discernment, is all these aspects. This is the great knowledge. And furthermore, very strong suggestion that it is freed of time sequence, because the ordinary mind cannot think without time. In fact, Immanuel Kant, before that Aristotle even speaks in terms of 12 categories of thought. It requires 12 aspects coming from the mind: space, time, causality, quantity, etc. I don't even remember now what the 12 are, but time is certainly one of them, which is why it completely surprises people to come across a remark like this. For example, Christ saying, before Abraham was, I am. Time does not have the same meaning or relevance for him. And then, of course, the very next verse in that chapter is quoted here. Then they picked up stones to throw at Jesus, but he hid himself and slipped out of the temple precincts, which will be one of the siddhis of yoga described by Patanjali in the 3rd chapter. Making himself disappearing. So we need to understand that the kind of knowledge which is being spoken about is altogether a different kind of thing, and the highest state of consciousness is called kaivalya, which is so the deep in viveka. Chitta, which is the mind, if you like, or consciousness, gravitates towards kaivalya. Kaivalya, again, is sometimes translated as onlyness. It is, to be sure, aloneness, but in the sense of Plotinus uses this expression, the movement of the alone to the alone. Alone meaning only if one thing remains, combination of seeing, seer, and seen. Observer and observed are together. Krishnamurti emphasized this all the time, practically like a slogan. And so we need to keep this in mind. And here I'm suggesting these two exercises for you, if you wish. Remaining in contact with the fact of breathing taking place, open to the mystery. Do I breathe or am I being breathed? Another exercise, if you wish to try, How do you distinguish between freedom for myself and freedom from myself? What practical implications does this distinction have in life, in your own life? And then I'm just drawing your attention to my forthcoming book on the Bhagavad Gita. It's coming out in the middle of May, published by Shambhala Publications. You can see some details and some pre-publication reviews. Particularly the Theosophists will be interested that Joy Mills spoke very highly of this manuscript that I had sent to her. On Amazon.com, you can read some of these things. And I have been persuaded by Jim and Pablo to give 4 more webinars, but the earliest I can do this in June. So you see that is written there, June 3rd, 10th, 17th, and 24th. But we'll start at 10 a.m. Central Time, because my friends in India can then come at 8:30 p.m. And people in Switzerland, it will be only 5:30 p.m. for them, and in England only 4:30, so it's not so bad. Not 4:30, it'll be actually 4 p.m. in England and 5 p.m. in Switzerland. Okay, well, I wish you luck, and I hope you don't take anything I say without questioning. This is absolutely important. If you take it seriously, you must question this. And then I have these 2 quotations here. One is, of course, really an invitation from Krishna, be firm in yoga and arise. Then I am very fond of this remark of Matsuda Basho, a great Japanese haiku writer. Seek not to follow in the footsteps of the wise ones of old. Seek what they sought. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you everybody for participating in the webinar. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.